Martha lived where the road gave out and the silence began. Her home was the old stone bell tower in Willow Creek, a place where the air itself seemed to wait for something. She was the bell ringer, the keeper of the chime, though only twice a year did the great bronze tongue swing free. Once for the summer harvest, and once, always, for Christmas Eve. This night, the air was sharp enough to break glass, and the snow outside piled up like sins forgiven. Martha, 35 years old and feeling every single one of them in the hollow sound of her footsteps, was busy oiling the gears. She wore a thick wool shawl, faded red like a sunset seen through too much smoke, but the cold crept past it, bone deep and certain. Her loneliness was not a recent visitor. It was an old tenant, sitting quiet in the best chair by the hearth. All the townsfolk knew Martha was good, steady, and alone. They whispered that she was bound to the tower just like the bell itself, never meant to travel far from the sound of its own deep voice. She finished her work, wiped her hands, and looked out the narrow, arched window. The world was a white, unforgiving sheet. The quiet was a deep, velvet thing, pressed against the walls, demanding attention. She sighed, settling down with her single flickering lamp and a worn prayer book, waiting for the hour. She knew what she would pray for, the same thing every year, a purpose beyond the ringing, a connection that didn't echo. She didn't know yet that her prayer was about to walk right through the icy door. The wind outside was howling a mournful, hungry tune, shaking the thick, iron-bound door at the base of the tower. Martha tried not to listen. She told herself it was just the north wind, come down from the ridges to collect a toll of heat and comfort. But this was a meaner, more specific sound, like a soul scratching to get in. She rose, slowly, her joints protesting the cold, and went down the winding stone stairs, her lamp casting shadows that looked like other, taller people following her. When she reached the bottom landing, the scratching stopped. She held the lamp high. There, slumped against the heavy door, was a man. He was frozen stiff, covered in a sheath of ice that looked like smooth, dark glass, and his clothes were ancient, rough-spun, clinging to a frame that was too thin and too still. He must have been out in the worst of the blizzard for days, maybe longer. Martha didn't scream or panic. The quiet loneliness had prepared her for odd, unnerving visitors. She saw not a corpse, but a challenge, a sudden, desperate demand placed upon her solitude. She knelt, her hand hovering over the ice on his face. He was young, impossibly young, with features that, even under the frost, hinted at a steady, honest gaze. This was no ordinary traveler caught in a sudden storm. This was something left behind, something the wind had meant to keep. She knew in her gut what she had to do, and it was a thing that went beyond common sense and good judgment. Dragging him was impossible. The man was locked to the door by the ice that bonded him to the stone. Martha had to use the small, sharp fire axe kept for emergencies near the woodpile, chipping carefully at the ice that bound his cloak to the floor. The sound of the small axe striking the frozen air was loud and violent in the quiet, an offense against the solemnity of the night. She worked for nearly an hour until the frozen man finally slid free. A cold, heavy mass she had to roll onto a spare tarp she used for keeping the snow off the bell ropes. She wrestled him up the stairs, inch by painful inch, until they reached the small, main room where her fireplace lived. She stripped off his outermost layer, a heavy, stiff cloak, and piled every single piece of wood she had onto the fire, coaxing a roaring, hungry flame to life. The warmth, when it finally radiated, was a sharp blessing. Then she sat beside him, watching the ice on his face begin to melt, turning his beard and hair damp and dark. His skin remained pale, blue-tinged, without a hint of a heartbeat she could find. The quiet was a deep, velvet thing, but now it was broken by the frantic, hopeful crackle of the fire, fighting death for dominance. She knew the hour was near, the hour when the tower demanded its purpose. She had to ring the bell. It was Christmas Eve, and she was Martha, the bell ringer. Even if the man was truly gone, even if the town was sleeping, the ritual demanded she perform her duty. She left the traveler by the now roaring fire, wrapping him tight in her thickest blankets, and ascended the final flight of stone steps to the belfry. The great bell, named Respite by the long-forgotten builder, stood dark and immense against the starry, cold sky visible through the open arches. Martha gripped the heavy main rope. Usually, she paused, offered a small, formal prayer for the town's safety and prosperity. Tonight, her prayer was different. It was selfish and raw, a plea born of the deep, empty ache in her soul, focused entirely on the man below. "Let this sound mean something more than time," she whispered to the freezing air. "Let this be for the lost who still have a road to walk. Let him be found." Then she pulled. The rope cut into her hands, but she pulled again and again, putting all her loneliness, all her worry, all her sudden, desperate hope into the effort. The bell boomed, a deep, resonating wave of sound that swallowed the quiet whole. It wasn't just a sound. It was a physical force, rattling the ancient stones of the tower and shaking the snow off the roof tiles. It rang 12 times, the midnight bell for Christmas Day. And as the final, lingering echo faded, Martha felt a tug, not on the rope, but on her very being, a sensation she couldn't name, like a missing piece of her own heart had finally snapped back into place. She raced back down the stairs, slipping once on the stone, her lamp swinging wildly. She burst into the firelit room, gasping. The man was still, wrapped in blankets, but the blue tinge was gone from his skin. And then he stirred. His eyes opened, wide and gray, the color of a winter sky just before dawn. He didn't look confused or scared, just immensely tired, as if he had just finished a very long, very complicated journey. He looked straight at Martha, and a tiny, dry sound escaped his lips, a word she almost didn't hear over the retreating sounds of the bell. The midnight bell rings for what is lost and what is found. "Martha," he whispered, his voice like the crackle of old parchment. He said her name not as a question, but as a certainty, a conclusion he had long expected. Martha staggered back a step, colliding with the iron stove. How could he know her name? The man had been frozen for what must have been days, maybe weeks, in clothes that looked like they had been made before her mother was born. She had never seen him before, never heard his voice. Yet he spoke her name with the intimacy of a husband calling for his wife. This was the first true spark of fear. A deep, ancient folktale fear that something impossible had just happened inside her tower. "Who are you?" she managed, her own voice suddenly thin and reedy. The man tried to sit up, wincing at the movement, but those gray eyes never left hers. "My name is Caleb," he replied, and he looked around the room, taking in the stone, the fire, the simple cot. "And I've been looking for you, for a very, very long time." He tried to lift his hand, stiff and cold, toward her face, but the effort was too much, and he collapsed back onto the pillow, falling into a deep, natural sleep, the sleep of a man who had finally reached the end of a long, dark road. Martha didn't sleep at all that night. She fed the fire, brewed weak tea, and sat on the low stool, watching Caleb breathe. His breath was shallow, steady, and warm, proof that the bell and her desperate prayer had indeed worked a miracle. But the miracle brought with it a cold, sharp dread. Decades are but a flicker in the memory of the tower, and Caleb's clothes and his certainty spoke of things that stretched beyond Martha's own memory. She gently examined the layers of fabric she had peeled from him. The cloak was a weave she had never seen, heavy linen and thick wool, stitched with symbols that looked like broken circles. His boots were leather, cured hard and thick, but worn down to nothing at the soles, suggesting years of walking. Everything about him was foreign, yet familiar, like a melody heard long ago and forgotten until this very moment. When the morning sun finally broke over Willow Creek, painting the snow a blinding, hopeful white, Martha knew she couldn't keep him a secret. But she also knew that explaining him would be impossible. He was her responsibility now, a piece of the great velvet quiet that had finally spoken back to her. The first person to see Caleb was Mr. Everett, the old, suspicious postmaster, who brought Martha her meager supply of coal every first day of the month, even if the first day was Christmas. He stomped the snow from his boots, pushed open the iron door, and immediately spotted the foreign man sleeping by the fire. Everett stopped dead, his mouth open like a forgotten trap. "Martha, who is that? He looks like he's been sleeping in a tomb." Martha calmly explained she'd found him frozen by the door at midnight. She left out the part about the prayer and the bell, because some truths were too fragile for Mr. Everett's hard heart. Everett circled Caleb warily, his eyes narrowed. "He's got the look of a wanderer, Martha. A stranger. They bring trouble, they always do. Look at his clothes. They're older than the tower itself." He muttered something about calling the sheriff. A man who lived 3 towns over and wouldn't arrive for days. Martha stood firm, planting herself between Everett and Caleb. "He is my guest, Mr. Everett." The midnight bell rang, and he woke up. "That is all you need to know." Everett grumbled, dropped the coal with a loud, disrespectful thud, and left, the iron door slamming shut, carrying the seed of suspicion out into the white, waiting town. When Caleb finally woke up in the late afternoon, he was stronger, and the firelight gave his gray eyes a startling intensity. Martha gave him broth, thin, nourishing, and warm. He ate slowly, savoring the heat. "The sound," he said suddenly, looking up at the ceiling. "It was the sound that brought me back. The great, deep ring." Martha felt a blush creep up her neck. "That was Respite. The midnight bell." "Respite?" Caleb repeated, a faint, melancholic smile touching his lips. It felt like being called home from a very long path. "I remember the cold, Martha, the endless, crushing cold, and then a chime. And I knew where I was." She pressed him again. "Caleb, where did you come from? Your clothes, they are not of this time." He looked down at the rough, worn fabric of his trousers, touching the strange stitching. "I was traveling, always traveling. I was looking for a tower, a bell, and a woman named Martha." He paused, his expression clouding over. "I had a purpose, a singular purpose, given to me by a promise. I think I left you, Martha. I think I left you and had to come back. But I don't remember the leaving, only the road." His words were heavy with ancient sorrow, echoing the loneliness she had always known. The quiet was a deep, velvet thing, and now it seemed to listen to Caleb's lost memory. The next few days were an uneasy truce with the town. Mr. Everett's gossip had done its work. People came up to the tower, not with neighborly cheer, but with questions disguised as gifts. A loaf of bread, a jar of preserves. They peered past Martha, trying to catch a glimpse of the man who looked like he'd crawled out of a history book. Martha was fiercely protective. She kept Caleb hidden, letting him regain his strength by the fire, talking to him about the world he had missed. He spoke little of the past, only disjointed fragments. A field of flowers that were now a parking lot, a dirt road that was now the main highway, a tiny chapel that had long since burned down. "It's all changed," he would whisper, running a hand over the smooth, new wood of her table. "It's all speeding up. When I started my journey, the world was slow. It was still." Then he would look at her with that intense, knowing gaze. "But the tower, and you, Martha, you are exactly where you were meant to be, like a fixed point in time." She began to understand that when he said he had been searching for decades, he meant it literally. He was a man out of time, a ghost given flesh by the midnight bell. And Martha, the lonely bell ringer, was his anchor to a world that had moved on without him. Caleb's presence brought a conflict Martha had never faced. The warmth of another soul versus the isolation she had perfected. Her routine was shattered. She cooked for 2, cleaned for 2, and talked until her voice was hoarse. The deep, velvet quiet of the tower was gone, replaced by the soft sounds of Caleb's breathing, the murmur of their conversations, and the steady, comforting beat of a shared life. But he had a restlessness about him. He needed to know why he had left, why he had been frozen, and why the bell was the only thing that could call him back. He began to explore the small tower room, running his fingers along the mortar between the stones. On the back of the fireplace, under a layer of soot, he found something. It was a crude inscription, deeply scratched into the stone. C and M always awaits. The sight of it made his eyes water. "I did this," he said, his voice trembling. "I remember the feel of the stone. I carved this here, waiting for the first fire to be lit in this spot. But when? When was this tower built, Martha?" Martha felt the history of the place. A dark, forgotten history, closing in. "They say it was built 150 years ago, Caleb, by a master stonemason who vanished the day it was finished." That evening, Caleb told her the most complete memory he had yet offered. It was about the bell. "The bell was supposed to be a promise," he said, staring into the flames. "I was a young man, a stonemason's apprentice. We built this tower together. It was meant for the people of this valley, to mark their joys and sorrows. But I found a way to make it more. I put a piece of myself into the metal when it was cast. A wish, a vow." He described the secret, long-forgotten ritual, mixing an heirloom, a small silver locket, into the molten bronze. "I did it because of a girl. She was supposed to be the first bell ringer. She was moving to this valley, and I promised her I would be the keeper of the tower until she arrived. The bell was our meeting place. It was meant to ring for the rest of our lives together." He paused, the sorrow returning, heavier now. "But something went wrong. I finished the tower, waited for the first snow, and then I froze. Not from the cold, but from the waiting. I became part of the quiet, the velvet thing. I only woke when someone with the right heart, a lonely heart that understood the sound of a vow, pulled the rope and spoke the prayer." He looked at her, his gaze unwavering. "Martha, were you that girl? Are you her granddaughter? The woman I promised to wait for?" The full weight of his decades-long journey hit Martha. She was 35, an orphan raised by her distant aunt, and she had never felt she belonged anywhere but this drafty stone tower. Was it possible she was the descendant of the promised bell ringer? She ran a hand over the rough carving on the fireplace. "C and M always awaits. C for Caleb, M for Martha." A shiver that had nothing to do with the cold ran down her spine. "I don't know my family history, Caleb. I only know the tower was willed to me when I turned 20, and that I've lived here ever since." But the feeling, the deep-seated familiarity, was undeniable. That night, Martha climbed back up to the belfry, determined to look for the silver locket Caleb had mentioned. She shone her lamp over the immense bell. Respite. The bronze was smooth, darkened by time and weather. She searched every inch, running her hands over the cold, rough metal, but found nothing. The locket was truly absorbed into the voice of the bell. "The midnight bell rings for what is lost and what is found," she thought, but maybe the finding was her, and the lost was the locket, swallowed by fate. Caleb's health improved quickly, fueled by Martha's care and the burning need to know the truth. He discovered that the small, windowless storage room adjacent to the belfry, a place Martha had always used to store old ropes and dust-covered tools, was not just a storage room. Tucked behind a stack of splintered wooden planks, he found a hidden section of the wall, and behind that, a shallow alcove. Inside the alcove lay a single, dark, leather-bound journal. It was brittle with age, the pages turned the color of dry leaves. Caleb gently opened it. The ink was faded, the handwriting delicate and flowing, but recognizable. It was the handwriting of a woman. The first entry was dated over 150 years ago. The first word was simple yet devastating in its context. "Caleb." Martha stood beside him, her breath held tight in her chest. The quiet was thick, heavy with the dust of old secrets and forgotten vows. They knew, instantly, that the secrets of the tower, and of Caleb's frozen journey, were about to spill out onto the dusty floor of Martha's world. They spent the next day reading the journal together by the fire. The journal belonged to the original Martha, the girl Caleb had loved, the one he had built the tower and the promise for. She wrote of their brief, passionate love, his skill as a stonemason, and the depth of his vow to wait for her. But the journal also contained the conflict that led to Caleb's freezing. The original Martha's family, wealthy landowners, forbade the marriage to a mere apprentice. They forced her to leave the valley suddenly, giving her only enough time to write a final, frantic note to Caleb, which she hid beneath the hearth of her family's then new house. When Caleb came looking for her, he found the note, which told him she was gone but would eventually return. He was devastated. He didn't want to leave the tower, his promise, and the bell. So he made an ill-fated choice. He used the same dark, forgotten ritual that fused the locket into the bell to create a kind of stasis. A deep sleep that would keep him alive, frozen in time, until the lineage of his love, the future bell ringer, arrived to wake him with the sound of the bell and a focused prayer of the heart. The original Martha returned years later, heartbroken, but Caleb was gone. Frozen in the tower, indistinguishable from the stone and ice. She never found the secret alcove where Caleb froze. She became the first bell ringer, settling into the lonely vigil he had created. She passed the tower and the duty, down through her female descendants, hoping that one day, one of them, bearing her name, would unknowingly fulfill the prophecy and wake her beloved Caleb. Martha read the final, tear-stained entry aloud. I have waited, my daughter waits now, and her daughter after. The bell holds our hearts. When the time is right, Caleb, the bell will call you home to a Martha who is truly ready to receive you. Martha looked up at the man beside her, his gray eyes shining with a strange, impossible mix of ancient memory and new realization. He had not been looking for an ancestor. He had been looking for a destiny, fulfilled now in her. She was not the descendant. She was the final, chosen heart in the long, lonely chain. Decades are but a flicker in the memory of the tower.